Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. This is a story about what if Deku ruled a kingdom of shadows part 1. If you guys enjoy this what if and want to see part 2, comment down below and let me know before I start. Please do support for more awesome content. And leave a like and don't forget to subscribe to my channel and also share this video with your friends and check out the description in my playlist. So let's start the video. Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. Izuku crouched down and waited for the double doors to open. At 5 years old, the little demon prince was small enough to completely hide behind a porcelain vase. Only the tips of his black wings pointed out. The doors to the throne room opened as a guest approached, a man in a fancy blue kimono, no doubt presenting a petition to High Lord 𝘆𝘆. Izuku saw his chance. He darted forward. Air rushed through his hair as he took flight. The guards cried out as he soared over their heads, but no one dared grab him. They knew that if they laid a finger on the High Lord's son, it would mean their lives. In his rough and clumsy flight, Izuku tumbled over the heads of several demons in elaborate kimonos. He nearly bumped into the hair of a woman wearing a tall bun topped with a jeweled comb. She dropped to her face on the floor to avoid touching him. Waving his arms, Izuku careened toward the golden throne at the end of the red silk carpet. Daddy, High Lord 𝘆𝘆, known to his family as 𝘆𝘶, looked up. He wore a 𝘂𝘂, a traditional embroidered robe with heavy triangular sleeves. The outer coat on top of the white pants made his giant size even more imposing. Only the High Lord could wear that particular shade of dark yellow. Ram horns curled over his curly white hair. Each gem on his golden crown gleamed with magic. The tips of his white bat wings perked up at the sight of his son. "My little bittern," he cried, the term for a baby bat. Izuku landed in his father's outstretched arms. "Daddy, I can fly," he cried. Izuku had taken flight for the first time earlier in the morning, under his mother's patient teaching. Naturally, he'd run to show his beloved father right away. 𝘆𝘶 kissed the top of his son's head. "What a wonderful first flight. I'm so proud of you, bittern. This deserves a special gift. What would you like?" Izuku giggled. "I don't know." His father always gave Izuku anything he wanted the instant a hint of desire left his mouth. The young demon prince's bedroom overflowed with rare and valuable treasures from around the world. Izuku could think of nothing he didn't already have. 𝘆𝘶 smiled. "Then I'll have to surprise you." He looked up, and his face hardened. "What are all of you still doing here? Leave us. I'm celebrating my son's first flight." The demon guest in the blue robe cleared his throat. "High Lord, I traveled a long way to meet with you. Then I'm sure your business can wait until tomorrow." 𝘆𝘶 spoke in a soft, deadly voice. Every demon in the room fled. 𝘆𝘶 turned his adoring eyes on his son seated in his lap. "What a precocious child you are. You're flying even younger than Y." But he was sickly, of course. "I'm so proud of you. I love you, Daddy." Izuku beamed. "I love you more than all the magic in the world, my little bittern." 𝘆𝘶 cuddled his son close. This was high praise indeed, because everyone knew High Lord 𝘆𝘆 had the power to steal magical gifts, and an endless appetite for them. Izuku chirped in pleasure, nestled in his father's warm arms. The moment was interrupted by a knock. 𝘆𝘶's head snapped up, his eyes blazing. A guard called timidly, "Please, begging your mercy, High Lord, but you long ago commanded us to bring anyone with word of your brother before you at once, no matter what business we had to interrupt." 𝘆𝘶's teeth ground as loudly as thunder. The arms around Izuku tightened. The poor guard stuttered. "Please, I really do think you want to see this. The bounty hunters have ... They have him. 𝘡𝘆. The guard could not bring himself to finish speaking the name which had been forbidden in the palace. 𝘆𝘶 glanced down and stroked his son's head. He whispered, "This will only take a minute, bittern. I'll take care of these fraudsters. Then I'll find the perfect gift for you." Izuku's deceased uncle 𝘊𝐿𝐻 was a tender and dangerous topic. 𝘆𝘶 often praised Izuku and gave him gifts whenever he acted at all similar to 𝘊𝐿𝐻. But when Izuku made the mistake of mentioning his uncle first, it would put his father in a bad mood for days. 𝘊𝐻 had taken her son aside and given him an abridged version of the story. Long ago, before Izuku had been born, Dad and Uncle 𝘊𝐿𝐻 had fought. Uncle 𝘊𝐻 had tried to run away from home, and he'd fallen into a pit of lava. Because there had been no body for a long time, Dad had clung to hope that his precious little brother might still be alive. He'd offered a massive bounty, enough for a demon to live like royalty for an immortal lifespan. This had lured in hundreds of con artists. Dad had been so furious that he made them all disappear. Mom had said that Dad still felt very sad about Uncle 𝘊𝐻's death and Izuku should not bring up the subject. "Come in," 𝘆𝘶 growled. Although with red light crackling from his eyes he became less 𝘆𝘶 and more 𝘆𝘆. A clawed hand tightened on the armrest. Izuku felt sorry for the bounty hunters who were about to make his father very angry. Though Izuku loved his father, he had seen other people suffer from 𝘆𝘆's vicious temper. The angry glares always turned to smiles whenever Izuku was around, so he tried to deflect his father's wrath whenever he could. The huge brass doors creaked open. Half a dozen burly demons in leather armor entered, dragging a prisoner behind them. The man's feathery white wings had been bound with leather straps and a muzzle covered his mouth. He hissed like an angry animal. Though he was taller than his captors, his thinness made him look frail. Golden sparks of magic danced off the chains around his arms, showing that he was desperately trying to use magic despite the suppression of his enchanted bindings. The prisoner looked up. His wild, long white hair shifted off his face, revealing emerald eyes with white pupils, the exact same shade of green as Izuku's own eyes. Izuku gasped, leaning forward to take a closer look. Even with dirt on his face and bruises on his arms, this man was the prettiest person Izuku had ever seen, except for his mother, of course. 𝘆_cie stood up. Izuku fell to the floor on his bottom. "Daddy," Izuku cried, shocked at how unceremoniously he'd been pushed off the throne. As if in a trance, 𝘆_cie walked forward. "Daddy, it hurts," Izuku shouted. His backside stung a little. Mostly Izuku felt shocked at being ignored by his father. 𝘆_cie had always immediately run to kiss and heal his scrapes and bruises. But this time, 𝘆_cie didn't even turn around. The bounty hunters parted before 𝘆_cie, bowing to the floor in silence. The sheer power radiating off the High Lord had rendered everyone in the room unable to move, except for the prisoner bitterly struggling to the end. Growls continued to spill from his gag as he thrashed. 𝘆_cie bent down in front of the prisoner. The other demon tensed, lowering his head to avoid meeting the High Lord's eyes. 𝘆_cie grabbed a fistful of white hair and yanked the man's head up. The prisoner spat at his face. "You're good," 𝘆_cie said hoarsely. The spittle trickled down his chin, but he didn't even wipe it off in his total focus. "Very good. I've never seen a fake as good as you." He stroked the dirty cheek reverently. The prisoner shuddered. "But true blood connection can't be imitated. As soon as I touch you with my magic, I'll know." The prisoner went mad, spitting and fighting against his chains. Still gripping the white hair, 𝘆_cie's hand began to glow. Sitting on the floor, Izuku watched raptly. No one in the room, from the guards to the bounty hunters, dared make a sound. The air crackled, then sang with power. Even on the other end of the throne room, Izuku could feel the resonance between the magic inside his father and the prisoner. This was irrefutable proof. The prisoner could only be Izuku's uncle 𝘃𝑐, returned from the grave. 𝘆_cie threw back his head and screamed with joy. He lunged forward, crushing the prisoner to his chest. His claws dug into the other's wings, leaving scratches on the chains. Without looking, 𝘆_cie said, "All of you will be greatly rewarded for bringing him, even more than I promised. You guards as well, for knowing to bring him here at once. Now get out of this room." The guards and bounty hunters fell all over each other in their haste to leave. The metal door clanked shut behind them. 𝘆_cie rocked his little brother in his arms like an oversized baby. Tears poured down his cheeks. 𝘆_cie wept silently except for the occasional gasp for air. Izuku had never before seen his father cry, and the sight made his chest prickle with uneasiness. 𝘃𝑐 had gone limp, sullen rage filling his eyes. "You're alive," 𝘆_cie whispered. "You're alive, you're alive, you're alive." His voice rose with each word. "I knew you faked it. I knew it. You hated me enough to hurt me like that. You wanted to leave me so badly. I'll never let you." His voice choked with sobs. "I'm so happy that you're alive." He removed the muzzle. Immediately, 𝘃𝑐 bit 𝘆_cie's ear. Through his tears, 𝘆_cie chuckled. Just like old times. He yanked his brother away by his hair. The injury healed immediately, from one of the demon lord's many powers. 𝘆_cie kept stroking 𝘃𝑐's hair as 𝘃𝑐 tried to move away from him. "Where have you been, my dear and foolish treasure?" 𝘃𝑐 clamped his mouth shut and glared. "Keep your secrets." 𝘆_cie laughed darkly. "I'll still hunt down every last person who kept you from me." There was something dark in this room, something that made goosebumps rise all down Izuku's wings. "Oh," he cried again, trying to snap his father out of it. Surely it would be unthinkable for his father to ignore his cries of pain for a third time. 𝘃𝑐 looked up. "I'd heard that you reproduced, big brother. I can't believe that you found anyone who wanted you. So this is the boy. He looks just like you as a child. He's hurt, shouldn't you help him? Oh, so you'll acknowledge other people but not me." 𝘆_cie's voice filled with a simmering anger. His dark gaze fell on his son. Izuku flinched. He had seen that look of jealousy on his father's face before, whenever Izuku paid attention to someone else. But this was the first time that Izuku had been the target of the hostility. It made him shudder and slide backwards on his bottom. 𝘃𝑐's voice rose. "I see your pettiness hasn't changed one bit." Arms tightening around his brother, 𝘆_cie growled at Izuku. "I ordered everyone in this room to leave. What are you still doing here? But you pushed me off your lap and it hurts." Izuku's lower lip wobbled. Tears overflowed from his eyes. "Izuku, leave," 𝘆_cie snarled. Izuku stumbled to his feet and fled the throne room, too shocked and scared to even remember how to fly. His father never called him my little bitten again. Izuku rushed down the hallway, carrying his stuffed rabbit, his favorite drinking cup, and a dozen drawings. His father loved gifts, both receiving them and showering Izuku with them. If 𝘂𴑂 gave his most cherished possessions to his father, then surely Daddy would stop being strange. Ahead, 𝘂𴑂 heard his father's voice, too distantly to make out but in a questioning tone. 𝘂𴑂 picked up his pace. An unfamiliar demon replied, "We've interrogated the bounty hunters about your brother's location, but they don't know where he has been hiding." 𝘂𴑂 rounded the corner so fast that he ran into someone's legs. "Oopsie," he cried, lunging to catch his stuffed rabbit before it fell. The strange demon leapt backward, crying, "Your Highness, I'm so sorry." He cast a terrified glance at 𝘆𝘂, but 𝘆𝘂 did not look upset at the man who had bumped into 𝘂𴑂. Instead, he stared down at his son with a look of annoyance, as if he'd found a possession out of place. 𝘂𴑂 held up his greatest treasures. "Daddy, these are for you. I drew a new drawing of us, too." He shifted his arms to show a picture of his mother and father holding hands with 𝘂𴑂 in the middle. Coldly, 𝘆𝘂 said, "I'm busy right now. I don't need children's toys. Run along." The demon looked between the High Lord and his son, a calculating look forming on his face. 𝘂𴑂 did not understand that look, but it made him shiver. 𝘂𴑂 whispered, "Are you angry at me, Daddy?" Surely that must be it. 𝘂𴑂 must have done something wrong without realizing, like that time he'd asked his father where his uncle had gone. If only his father would tell him what he'd done. Then 𝘂𴑂 could apologize and everything would go back to normal. "Yes, I'm angry at you," 𝘆𝘂 said, "because you're still standing in my way." 𝘂𴑂's world shattered. Tears and sobs shook his small body. He could not move. His legs remained frozen as his father walked around him and left without a backward glance. For the last hour, 𝘂𴑂 had been sobbing into his pillow. He had finally run out of tears. Only a few sad hiccups remained. When 𝘂𴑂 heard the sound of the footsteps, he sat up and rubbed his face, trying to hide the tear tracks. It could only be his mother. 𝘂𴑂 and 𝘁 lived in a luxurious set of rooms taking up the entire basement of the palace. 𝘆𝘂 had an adjoining bedroom. Only the 3 family members were permitted in the lower floor. Heavy wards would kill anyone else who tried to enter. The rooms were cleaned by magic. 𝘁 had told 𝘂𴑂 that his father was extremely paranoid and didn't feel safe in a space occupied by anyone except family. Even 𝘁 herself wasn't permitted to stay in 𝘆𝘂's bedroom while he slept. Paranoia had also led 𝘆𝘂 to set up his bedroom in the basement, which he'd reinforced to survive any magical explosion or natural disaster. 𝘂𴑂 called, her voice drifting down the long corridor. Her sandals clacked on the floor. "Can I come in?" "Yes, Mommy," 𝘂𴑂 said, proud of how he kept his voice steady. But as soon as 𝘁 saw his face, she knew. "Oh, baby," she whispered, rushing across the bedroom and flinging her arms around him. The kindness and the warmth of her hug made 𝘂𴑂 break down again. He sobbed into his mother's chest as she rocked him back and forth. "I'm sorry I wasn't here sooner," 𝘁 whispered. "I just came from a meeting with your father, the High Lord, your father. He says we have to move out of our rooms. I'm afraid we only have a few hours to pack. I'm so sorry." In a lower voice he probably hadn't been meant to hear, she muttered, "If I'd known 𝘂𝑐 was alive, I never would have married 𝘆𝘂. Hell, if only he could run off again." 𝘂𴑂 stiffened. "Is Daddy throwing you away?" Many demon lords and ladies casually discarded consorts every couple decades. But his mother had been the adored jewel of the court, seemingly safe from all machinations. "Is it because of me?" "Of course not. You've done nothing wrong." 𝘁 clung to 𝘂𴑂 tighter. "It's because your uncle has been returned home. The High Lord does not feel like 𝘂𝑐 will be safe if anyone else has access to the royal quarters. It's ridiculous, of course. I clearly explained that we were no threat and besides he could ward 𝘂𝑐's room so we couldn't enter. But he said ... Well, 𝘆𝘂 had always said that he only felt safe in spaces where no one except his family could enter. It went without saying that if he no longer wanted 𝘁 and 𝘂𴑂 in his safe space, then they were no longer family. 𝘂𴑂 whispered, "Did Daddy stop loving me?" I. 𝘁's inability to speak was its own answer. "I'm sure your father still ... I in his own way. Maybe he'll." 𝘂𴑂 couldn't understand how it was possible for his father, the person who had given him nothing but love for the first 5 years of his life, to simply stop loving him one day. "Will you stop loving me someday too, Mommy?" "No, never." 𝘁 clung to her son and wept. The High Lord's palace was guarded by shriekers, undead creatures that only obeyed the royal family. 𝘆𝘂 had not yet revoked 𝘁's ability to command them, so they let her pass. Spreading her black wings wide, she flew up the side of the palace. In a mad state of fury, 𝘁 pounded on the window of the High Lord's office. 𝘆𝘂, get your pointy-tailed butt over here." 𝘆𝘂 opened the window, taking in 𝘁 hovering outside, his face twisted with annoyance. "I told you that I was too busy to discuss your housing any further. My decision is final." 𝘁 screamed. "𝘂𝑐 has been crying his eyes out because he believes that you don't love him any longer. I couldn't tell him otherwise because you certainly haven't been acting like you do lately." Her voice choked. She swallowed before she started crying. It did not look like her husband was in any mood to be moved by tears. "Please, reassure Izuku. Just give him a single word. I've been comforting him all day, and he's still inconsolable." "Good for you for doing your duty as his mother," 𝘃_ᴬ said. He'd always praised her for being a good mother, but now there was a mocking edge to his tone. "What, did you come here to ask for a new necklace as a reward? As if you don't have enough jewelry already." ⴘᴇ swallowed back her tears again. In the past, 𝘃_ᴬ had often bestowed expensive presents on her whenever she made Izuku happy. It had been sweet but unnecessary. How dare he throw that in her face as mockery now? Between clenched teeth, she said, "I want you to do your duty as a father. You hurt your son. I'm far too busy to deal with a child's temper tantrum." 𝘃_ᴬ's wings snapped wide. His fangs flashed. ⴘᴇ involuntarily fluttered backward. In a voice crackling with magic, 𝘃_ᴬ growled, "Traitors and enemies kept my little brother from me for decades. I don't know who they are or if they will come after him again. The palace may be infested with spies. Don't you dare bother me with insignificant matters until I've hunted down and killed every last one of them." His eyes blazed red, magic enveloping his pupils. "Anyone who interferes with my search for the traitors will be treated as an accomplice." ⴘᴇ's wings shook, barely keeping her aloft. She knew her husband's reputation, but she'd never seen him so close to the edge of madness. His obsession with his little brother had always brought out the worst in him. Her marriage with 𝘃_ᴬ had been a political match. After the death of her entire family, she'd needed a protector and he desired their hereditary lands. Also, he'd wanted a family. She'd had an inkling that he'd wanted a replacement for his little brother. During their first meeting, he'd told her that he hoped that his white bat wings and her feathery black wings would combine to produce a child with white feathery wings ... just like 𝘃광. When Izuku had been born with black bat wings, ⴘᴇ had worried. Fortunately, her son had come out with his uncle's eyes, and 𝘃_ᴬ had doted upon him immediately. The more 𝘃_ᴬ adored Izuku, the more wealth and power he showered on his son's mother. ⴘᴇ had believed her gamble had paid off. She'd grown to care about her husband, and he'd been affectionate toward her, too. Even with the evidence staring her in the face, she struggled to believe that he'd completely throw her and Izuku away, just because he had his brother back in his possession. Did he not have room in his tiny, black heart for more than one person? ⴘᴇ swallowed. If she'd lost her husband's affection and protection, then she was in a very precarious position. She had little power without him. Worse, her son would become the target of the High Lord's exceptionally cruel court. She modulated her voice to be gentle and appealing. 𝘃_ᴬ, please, I understand why you wanted us to move out of our rooms. That's fine. It most certainly was not fine, but there was nothing she could do about it. But it will look to the court like you've abandoned us. People will start bullying Izuku just to see what they can get away with. Please, make some sort of gesture to show that we're still under your protection. If you would even bestow a small gift on Izuku or appear with him in public, that would be enough. 𝘃_ᴬ regarded her with the cold eyes of a stranger. Don't you think it's about time for Izuku to grow up and stop being so weak? He's a prince. He needs to learn to take care of his own enemies. ⴘᴇ's wings wilted. As she started to fall, she flapped rapidly to remain in place. Izuku is only 5 years old. You sheltered him all his life. It wasn't fair. Even though most demon nobility raised their children to be tough, 𝘃_ᴬ had always coddled Izuku. He had seemed to enjoy his son's weakness and dependency. But now he had the nerve to act as if this was someone else's problem. Izuku is very smart. He can definitely become a great asset to your court if you give him more time to grow up. 𝘃_ᴬ's lips curled back in a sneer. At Izuku's age, I'd already started making allies to take the throne. I was only a little older than him when I won my first duel against an adult. How can that child possibly be useful to me? Too late, ⴘᴇ realized that 𝘃_ᴬ did not truly want a strong son. That would be a threat to his power. As an immortal, he did not need an heir. He'd spoiled and doted on Izuku as a replacement for his little brother, but now he had his real brother back. He no longer had any use for Izuku at all. In a soft, defeated voice, she said, "We'll leave the court and return to my ancestral lands. Please grant us permission, my lord." They would have to live off a much smaller stipend, but Izuku had never been a greedy child. He gave away most of his toys to his friends. It would be better than letting Izuku be bullied and beaten by demons who wanted to prove themselves stronger than the abandoned prince. And then you'd become targets for my enemies or symbols to people who want to replace me. I think not, ⴘᴇ. When we married, you promised to stay at the palace. ⴘᴇ hissed, "You promised me many things you no longer plan to deliver." This bastard no longer wanted her or her son, but he was still too possessive to let them leave. Unfortunately, that was just like 𝘃_ᴬ. I have no time for this conversation. I must bring my little brother his meal. ⴘᴇ has been refusing to eat. Do not bother me again. 𝘃_ᴬ slammed the window shut in ⴘᴇ's face, clutching a golden crown tucked under his coat. Izuku crouched behind a bush, waiting for the walkway to the palace to clear. Instead of his usual noble kimono, today he'd changed into a gray yukata that didn't stand out. He wore slippers for moving silently. His new rooms were small and cramped, and their belongings had been damaged by the careless movers. Most of 𝘆𝑐𝑂's jewelry had been stolen. Even more importantly, several of her paintings had been destroyed. 𝘆𝑐𝑂 had taken up painting as a hobby since shortly after 𝘆𝑐𝑂's birth. She'd worked for nearly a year on a life-size detailed portrait of their family, but when they'd unwrapped it, water had completely destroyed the canvas. 𝘆𝑐𝑂 had nearly wept, but then put on a brave face and said she could make a new painting with just the two of them. Then 𝘆𝑐𝑂 had discovered that all her paints were missing, and she'd finally broken down crying. 𝘆𝑐𝑂 had a plan. He would sneak out of the palace and sell his crown, then buy his mother new paints. In fact, 𝘆𝑐𝑂 had 5 crowns his father had gifted him on each birthday. He'd picked a crown with a large diamond in the middle. Surely it would be worth enough money to give his mother a wagon full of paints and make her smile again. However, no matter how long 𝘆𝑐𝑂 waited, the people coming in and out of the palace were endless. 𝘆𝑐𝑂 pouted. The sun had nearly set. Finally, the walkway was deserted. 𝘆𝑐𝑂 stood up. "What are you doing out here?" someone asked from behind him. 𝘆𝑐𝑂 whirled around, then sighed in relief. It was 𝘁𝘂, Lord 𝘆𝑐𝑒's grandson and a good friend. "Hi, 𝘁𝘂. I'm sneaking out of the palace. I'm going to sell my crown to buy paints for Mom." He held it up. "Can you help me? Maybe I could pretend to be you, or you could sneak me out in your cart, or we could create a distraction together. The main gate has demonic guards as well as shriekers, but I have a couple plans." 𝘁𝘂's expression had been grumpy, but as 𝘆𝑐𝑂 rambled, a mean smile formed on his face. "Give me that." He snatched the crown. Tossing it in his hand, he chuckled. "I bet it's heavy because it's expensive." 𝘆𝑐𝑂 shifted, his wings twitching. "Please, be careful. If you dent my crown, I might not be able to sell it for as much money." "Don't you mean my crown?" 𝘁𝘂's smirk widened. He put the crown on his head. "I think it suits me more than you." 𝘆𝑐𝑂 chuckled nervously. "I can't give it to you. I need to sell it." Something felt wrong, but he pushed his doubts aside. 𝘆𝑐𝑂 had often given 𝘁𝘂 his toys before, so he could see where there had been a misunderstanding. Sometimes 𝘁𝘂 got a little pushy about wanting 𝘆𝑐𝑂's belongings, but he always backed off whenever 𝘆𝑐𝑂 told him to. 𝘆𝑐𝑂 never got upset because he knew he had more toys than his friend, and he wanted to share. Surely this time would be no different. 𝘁𝘂 kicked 𝘆𝑐𝑂 in the stomach. As he fell, 𝘆𝑐𝑂 cried out in both surprise and pain. This wasn't possible. His friends couldn't just stop liking him for no reason. Not like what had happened with his father. Shock kept him lying on his back staring up with watery eyes. Standing over 𝘆𝑐𝑂, 𝘁𝘂 crossed his arms and spread his red wings wide. "Listen up, weakling. I only pretended to be friends with you because my parents made me. Who would want to play with a pathetic demon who has no magic? Do you know how revolting it was to suck up to you? Now that your father threw you away, you're nothing. You're not strong enough to beat me, so from now on, I'll take whatever I want from you. That's the law of the demon world. I need a gift for Mom." 𝘆𝑐𝑂 got to his feet. "Give it back." He lunged, grabbing the crown. Surprise let him snatch it. 𝘆𝑐𝑂 leapt into the air, but 𝘁𝘂 had the gift of speedy flight. 𝘁𝘂 grabbed 𝘆𝑐𝑂 by the back of his collar and dragged him to the ground. "Give me the crown." 𝘁𝘂 howled. His face turned red and ugly. 𝘆𝑐𝑂 curled up in a ball, refusing to let go of the crown. Not even when 𝘁𝘂 kicked and punched him. A blow to 𝘆𝑐𝑂's head sent the world spinning and doubling. The guards ran over and hauled the two boys away. 𝘆𝑐𝑂 was mostly unconscious when the guards dragged him into the throne room. He only saw flashes of color and heard brief moments of sound. His head lolled, sending pain through his neck. Each word from the two close guards sent pain spiking through 𝘆𝑐𝑂's head. He was trying to sneak out of the palace. Hi, Lord, Daddy." 𝘆𝑐𝑂's head shot up. He made out the blurry figure of his father on the throne. In a dazed voice, he cried, "Daddy, it hurts," while holding out his bleeding arm. Coldly, 𝘆𝑐𝑒 said, "I sentence him to spend the night in the dungeon as punishment." As the guards dragged him away, 𝘆𝑐𝑂 remembered. His father didn't love him any longer. A guard stole the crown that 𝘆𝑐𝑂 had tried so hard to protect. 𝘆𝑐𝑂 came to pick 𝘆𝑐𝑂 up first thing the next morning. She'd worn an elaborate red and gold kimono with flowing sleeves to remind the guards of her status. But 𝘆𝑐𝑂 could tell from the sloppiness of the belt that she'd had trouble putting it on without her maids to help. She wept as she carried him back to their rooms. 𝘆𝑐𝑂 overheard his mother trading her earrings to a doctor with a healing gift. 𝘆𝑐𝑂 had never needed a doctor before. His father had always erased even the smallest scratch from his body right away. Over the last day, he had felt pain unlike anything in his short life. The healing completely vanished his injuries, but his mother told him to rest inside the room for a couple days. 𝘆𝑐𝑂 didn't argue. He felt unready to face the new, bleak world. A few days turned into a week. 𝘆𝑐𝑂 supposed that he had to leave his bedroom at some point, and his mother's concerned glances confirmed this. But he was scared, even more than the beating. He feared going outside to face the cold eyes of all the people who had once adored him and now had turned on him. As 𝘆𝑐𝑂 rested in bed, his shock and pain started to mix with anger. It wasn't fair. Daddy had been mean to 𝘰𴂃 just because his uncle had returned home. 𝘰𴂃 hadn't done anything wrong. The more 𝘰𴂃 thought about it, the more he wondered why his uncle had been dragged back in chains. His mother had said that Daddy and Uncle 𝘰𴂃 had a fight. That seemed like a very bad fight. If Daddy was that angry, why hadn't he thrown away Uncle 𝘰𴂃? Even though he threw away 𝘰𴂃, who did nothing wrong. 𝘰𴂃 decided to see his uncle. Maybe 𝘰𴂃 could tell him why 𝘰𴂃 had been abandoned and what he could do to get his father back. Late at night, 𝘰𴂃 threw on a green cotton kimono over his sleeping clothes. Then he snuck out of his room and followed the familiar route back to the basement where he used to live. Only shriekers guarded the stairwell. 𝘆𝘂 trusted no one living to obey his commands nearly as well as his undead minions. A dozen demon corpses with exposed brains formed a solid wall, but they slid aside to let 𝘰𴂃 pass. He was still a member of the royal family. The steel basement door glowed with a mixture of red, green, and yellow sigils, forming dancing and shifting patterns. 𝘰𴂃 placed his hands on top of the light. In the past, the wards had always vanished to let 𝘰𴂃 in, but now they remained steadily pulsing and impenetrable. 𝘆𝘂 must have changed them. Rage and frustration filled 𝘰𴂃, pounding out a brutal beat into his sleepy head. He refused to turn back. Frowning, 𝘰𴂃 remembered how his father's bedroom had always been protected by special wards. Only 𝘆𝘂 could turn them off, because he was the only person who had the gift to steal magic. His brow furrowing with concentration, 𝘰𴂃 pictured how his father would reach out a hand to touch the glowing lines. The shimmering magic pulsed under his fingers. Closing his eyes, 𝘰𴂃 tugged. He felt a strange tingling through his body. It was a comforting feeling, satiating him and vanishing his tiredness. When 𝘰𴂃 opened his eyes, the wards were gone. 𝘰𴂃 hadn't expected that to work. It must not be as hard as his father claimed. 𝘰𴂃 pushed open the door. As soon as it closed behind him, the glowing wards reappeared. Good. 𝘰𴂃 hadn't been sure how to put them back. The glowing stones lining the wall lighted automatically as 𝘰𴂃 climbed down the stairs. Stopping at the bottom, 𝘰𴂃 looked between a door on his left and a door on his right. He did not want to go into his father's bedroom. Daddy had always been a grump when woken, even before he turned mean. Since 𝘰𴂃 and his mother had been thrown out of their rooms to make space for 𝘰𴂃, that was probably where he could find his uncle. 𝘰𴂃 touched the door to the right. Once again, he tugged at the wards to make them vanish. When 𝘰𴂃 opened the door, for a moment he thought he'd picked the wrong one. This place looked nothing like his old quarters. All the walls between the rooms were gone, replaced by a giant garden. The light from the cracked door fell across a field of brilliant flowers. They alternated colors, from brilliant yellow tulips to purple lilacs to baby blue eyes. Bushes with small white flowers added a spattering of green. Wisteria grew up the walls and hung from the ceiling. But the beautiful garden had no scent. In the dim light, it took 𝘰𴂃 a moment to realize all the plants were artificial, shaped from clay or cloth. A winding path led to the cage in the middle of the room. The person-sized birdcage was made of pure gold. A round bed filled the entire bottom, just long enough for the prisoner inside to lie down. 𝘰𴂃 recognized his uncle from their fateful first meeting in the throne room. In sleep, 𝘰𴂃 looked even more beautiful and even more frail. The dim light falling on his thin wrists made his skin glow like moonlight. His small ears and nose were delicate as a doll's. A golden collar fastened around his neck. His white hair splayed around his head and horns, looking soft as a cloud. He'd wrapped his feathery white wings around his body like a cocoon. A handful of petals had fallen across his sleeping form, making him resemble a flower fairy. 𝘰𴂃's heart twisted. Had he always been a second-best replacement for this bewitchingly perfect angel? It felt like a magical spell had been cast over this beautiful scene, and he wondered if disturbing the sleeper would bring down a curse on his head. 𝘰𴂃 steeled his will and took a step forward. As soon as 𝘰𴂃 set foot in the artificial garden, a glowing ball of light overhead activated. The ceiling shifted to the color blue as the fake sunlight filled the room. The artificial plants looked more unnatural in the brightness. 𝘰𝑴ℎ sat up with low, long growl, pushing his hair off his face. He hissed, "It is too early in the hell's cursed morning. Big brother, if you woke me up because you had another fucking nightmare, interrupting the few precious hours I get without your loathsome company, then I swear I will rip out your spleen. I could replace it with the brain you apparently have no use for except to weigh down your inflated head. Those precious horns of yours are going straight up your ass. By the time I remove most of your spine, you'll be the only demon in the world who can self-fellatio. Were flower fairies usually this violent?" Apparently it had been a mistake for 𝘰𴂃 to rouse his uncle from his clearly much-needed beauty slumber. He wasn't sure what was a spleen, but he preferred it inside his body. His knees shaking too badly to make a run for it, 𝘰𴂃 dropped to his knees and hid behind a rosebush. 𝘆𝘂, 𝘰𴂃 looked around. His eyes widened as they fell on the bush. Realizing his wing was sticking out, 𝘰𴂃 quickly folded them behind his back. "A child," 𝘰𴂃 mumbled. "How did you get in here?" His eyes widened. "Nephew." As soon as 𝘂𝗟 identified him, the child turned and fled for the door. "Stop," 𝘂𝗟 cried. "Please." Sincere desperation filled his voice. It had been about a week since 𝘂𝗟's capture. By his best guess, his older brother kept feeding him at odd intervals and disrupting his sleep to disguise how much time had passed. Even so, 𝘂𝗟 had already grown frantic to hear the sound of any voice besides his asshole brother. This was not the first time 𝘂𝗟 had been locked down here, though admittedly the birdcage was new and creepy. This place brought back many painful memories for him of isolation and the slow breakdown of his self-sanity. At the moment, 𝘆𝘂 was still overly clingy and loath to leave 𝘂𝗟's side for anything but unavoidable business. But soon, 𝘂𝗟 knew his older brother would start letting him sit in solitary confinement for long periods in order to make him crave another's voice and touch. Just like last time, this might be 𝘂𝗟's last chance to talk to another person for a long time. "Please," he whispered, shrinking into himself. His nephew stopped, one foot in the air, his wings flapping slightly as he wobbled. 𝘂𝗟's second thought was even more shameful. This boy is my only chance to escape from my living death. 𝘂𝗟 would have no other contact with another demon anytime soon, not until his brother believed he'd broken. Maybe not ever. His brother refused to allow anyone else down here, using shriekers to feed 𝘂𝗟 whenever he couldn't personally. No matter what, 𝘂𝗟 had to win his nephew over. "I'm sorry for startling you." 𝘂𝗟 smiled in a soft, gentle way. Back in the days when 𝘂𝗟 had still been on his older brother's side, he'd mastered the art of charming people and appearing harmless in order to gather intel. "I've always been grumpy when I first wake up. I'm not a proper demon until it's been at least an hour. I reject the concept of morning. Civilized people only get up after noon." This won him a small giggle. "What's your name?" 𝘂𝗟 already knew the answer to his question. The announcement of the birth of High Lord 𝘆𝘂's son had been spread across the demonic realm, but he thought it would help him build a rapport to ask. His nephew looked up shyly from under his eyelashes. "I'm 𝘂𝗟. Pleased to meet you." 𝘂𝗟 stifled a yawn behind his hand. His eyes still hurt from being doused by bright light in the middle of the night. He adjusted his sleep-tousled robe. Big Brother had not given 𝘂𝗟 any sleeping clothing, since his doll had to look perfect at all times. 𝘂𝗟 wore a heavy silk kimono with brown hakama pants. His Haori jacket was a shade of orange only allowed to relatives of the High Lord. A traitor shouldn't have been permitted to wear it. Did 𝘆𝘂 think a fancy coat compensated for imprisonment? Was this further proof Big Brother didn't see 𝘂𝗟 as a person capable of committing treason as opposed to an object to be stolen? Or did 𝘆𝘂 just like how the color matched the gold collar? So far the potential scandal had been irrelevant because no one else ever saw 𝘂𝗟, until this small child had appeared. "My name is 𝘂𝗟, and I'm your uncle." "I know. I came here to see you." 𝘂𝗟's wings perked up. This was a good sign. His nephew was already interested in him. 𝘂𝗟 continued, "I wanted to know why my father stopped loving me when you came back." 𝘂𝗟's hopes plummeted back down to the ground. He'd barely even spoken to the kid and already he was hated. No matter what, he had to salvage this situation. He'd charmed many enemies before, long enough to knife them in the back. He gasped theatrically, letting his eyes fill with sympathy. "That's terrible. What happened?" "This stupid garden used to be my bedroom." 𝘂𝗟's gaze filled with pain. "My mom and I got thrown out as soon as you came home. Now Dad won't look at me or hug me. As soon as my father stopped treating me as important, so did everyone else. My best friend hit me. Dad didn't even care." 𝘂𝗟 burst into tears. "Oh, no. I'm so sorry." 𝘂𝗟 had always been a sympathetic crier, and with his emotions so on edge, the tears came easily. He freely let them fall. Hopefully 𝘂𝗟 would believe the tears were all for his sake. "Come over here." 𝘂𝗟 held out his arms through the bars. 𝘂𝗟 took a tentative step forward, then half ran, half flew into the embrace. The child's story had not surprised 𝘂𝗟, not after what he'd seen in the throne room. But he'd still found room for a bit more disappointment for his older brother in his heart. Even if 𝘆𝘂 hadn't been capable of being a good father, he could have at least been a decent one and protected his child from physical abuse. Through the bars, 𝘂𝗟 stroked 𝘂𝗟's back. "I'm sorry. You don't deserve any of that. Mom said that Dad stopped loving me because you're here." 𝘂𝗟 sniffled. "She thinks that everything would be all better if you were gone." 𝘂𝗟 winced. Great. Someone nearby and powerful had a strong incentive to kill him. It wouldn't be the first time. All of his brother's previous 5 lovers had tried to murder 𝘂𝗟. In doing so, each one had ensured they didn't leave the relationship alive. 𝘆𝘂 used to pick people obsessively in love with him because he enjoyed the worship, then act surprised at the inevitable violence directed at his poor, innocent sibling. Each of the last 5 lovers had resented 𝘂𝗟 for being the only person who 𝘆𝘂 truly loved, if obsession could be called love. The last one had even accused 𝘂𝗟 of an incestuous affair with his own brother. It wasn't true, but 𝘂𝗟 could hardly blame her for thinking it when 𝘃_ᴂ had been creeping into his little brother's bed whenever he had a nightmare while refusing to let her ever stay the night. 𝘂𝗟 suspected that his older brother simply didn't do romantic love. 𝘃_ᴂ only loved family because he saw his little brother as a part of himself. That would explain why 𝘃_ᴂ always acted so shocked when 𝘂𝗟 had his own opinions, as if his liver had joined an opposing political faction and tried to vacate his midsection. 𝘂𝗟 wished he could have transferred his brother's toxic love over to his would-be murderers and see how they liked it. The last murder attempt had come the closest to killing 𝘂𝗟, because he'd been already imprisoned at that point. It wasn't easy to run while chained down. 𝘂𝗟 remembered the pain of the knife in his guts every time he traced the scar on his stomach, and he remembered his brother's smothering afterward as equally bad. Now that 𝘂𝗟 had been locked in an even smaller cage, he had limited ability to fight back if ⴇᴅ decided to regain her husband's favor and her position by assassinating him. Fortunately, 𝘂𝗟 looked too young to have realized how many of his problems would be solved if his uncle dropped dead. The boy seemed naive, judging by how easily he'd come close enough for 𝘂𝗟 to take him hostage. 𝘃_ᴂ had probably spoiled his replacement up until very recently. Still, 𝘂𝗟 resolved to remain on his guard against this child. 𝘃_ᴂ had killed for the first time when not much older than 𝘂𝗟. At age 5, 𝘂𝗟 had served as bait to help his brother lure enemies into traps. Murder ran in the family. As 𝘂𝗟's sobs faded to sniffles, 𝘂𝗟 kept rubbing his back. "I hate to see you suffering like this, my dear nephew. If only I'd never been found." 𝘂𝗟 nearly explained why it wasn't his fault. He'd never wanted to go near his big brother for the rest of his life. But then he remembered that it generally made people more sympathetic when you claimed full responsibility for something that wasn't your fault. "I feel so guilty. This all happened because of me. I want to help you." "You do?" 𝘂𝗟 looked up with wide, hopeful eyes. "Of course. We're family." 𝘂𝗟 took 𝘂𝗟's hand. "As you can see, I'm trapped here." He gestured with his free hand at the golden cage. "I want to leave. Will Daddy love me again when you're gone?" 𝘂𝗟 asked. 𝘂𝗟 didn't know. 𝘃_ᴂ would probably turn his affection back to the replacement if 𝘂𝗟 died. But 𝘂𝗟 wasn't sure if his mere absence would have the same effect. But that wasn't what 𝘂𝗟 wanted to hear. 𝘂𝗟 lied. "Yes, I'm sure of it." "Why?" 𝘂𝗟 asked. 𝘂𝗟's eyebrow twitched before he resumed his gentle expression. "Why what? Why can't Daddy love both of us?" 𝘂𝗟 wanted to tell his nephew exactly how lucky he was to have a chance to rid himself of 𝗷𝗲's cursed love. But he didn't, because that wasn't in his own best interest and 𝘂𝗟 probably wouldn't believe it anyway. Instead, 𝘂𝗟 said, "Your father gets obsessed with anything he wants. He decided to become Demon King, so he rearranged society until he came out on top. He wanted to steal more gifts, so he started a war. He wanted me to stay by his side, so he stuck me in a birdcage, even though I'm not a bird." 𝘂𝗟 smiled in an artfully rueful way, inviting the child to see the twisted humor in the situation. Though there was nothing funny about this to 𝘂𝗟 himself. "Once I'm out of sight, he'll no longer be so fixated on me that he can't see anything else. Then he'll remember you again." Actually, 𝘂𝗟 fully expected his brother to chase him down to the ends of hell unless he could convincingly fake his own death again. And that trick wasn't likely to work twice. 𝘂𝗟 gnawed on his lower lip. "Why did you fight with Daddy and leave?" 𝘂𝗟 resisted the urge to slam his face into the golden bars. Did all children ask so many questions? Especially at such an early hour of the morning when his head hurt. In his dim memories of his childhood, Big Brother had complained about 𝘂𝗟 always asking why, so perhaps 𝘂𝗟 came by the trait honestly. 𝘂𝗟 looked at his hands and squeezed another tear from his eye, taking the time to think about how to explain his relationship with 𝘃_ᴂ to a child without using profanity. "I had to run away because my older brother locked me up in a cage." "But he wouldn't have locked you up if you hadn't tried to run away," 𝘂𝗟 pointed out. 𝘂𝗟 couldn't help a snort. "You might be surprised. He wouldn't have gone as far as the birdcage, but he refused to let me leave the palace unless he accompanied me. He claimed it was too dangerous. I can't leave the palace without an adult, either. You're a child. Just think of how you'd feel if you still had to follow the same rules after you grew up." 𝘂𝗟 couldn't tell if this argument was getting through. Could a child understand? Also, we had political differences. "Why did you have political differences?" "Ugh, that why again?" "Your father thought that everything in the world belonged to him, including me." I disagreed. 𝘂𝗟 frowned, seeming to consider this carefully. "Dad always takes stuff from the demons who come to the throne room. They aren't always happy about it. I remember a few times when I saw something I wanted and Daddy took it, but then Mom made me give it back later. She said it's not nice to take other people's things. I didn't like it when Tsubasa took my crown. Dad shouldn't take what belongs to other people." 𝘂𝗟 stood up straighter. "We should teach him that it's wrong." "Great idea. After I leave, then your father will come to understand that he can't own everything." Hell would freeze over first, but 𝘂𝗟 needed to get this conversation back to the important topic, his escape. "𝘂𝗟, can you be a brave boy and help me?" Please. 𝘃𝑚 summoned up the full power of his pleading eyes. He collapsed to the cushions so he could meet the boy's eyes. There was an art to how 𝘃𝑚 pouted as he added, I need you. Izuku's eyes filled with resolve. I'll try. He touched the bars of the cage. I can feel magic in these too, but different from the door. The cage has an alarm directly tied to my brother's magic, 𝘃𝑚 warned. He'll know as soon as these doors open. We have to save that part for last. How did you get in here at all? It should have been impossible for anyone except 𝘃𝑚 to enter the basement. I did what Daddy did. I touched the magic, then took it. 𝘠:ⴌⴏ. His nephew had Big Brother's gift. That could be a political game changer. That power had turned 𝘃𝑚 from a nobody to a nightmare. It would make Izuku sought out by powerful demons who would want to use him or kill him. 𝘃𝑚 wondered how Big Brother would react to a child with his own gift. Would Izuku be treated like a threat? Better if 𝘃𝑚 never found out. 𝘃𝑚 reached through the cage to pat Izuku's hand. That was very clever. You should make sure no one knows that you can do that. Izuku nodded. My father can't find out that I can come down here until after you're gone. Don't let anyone find out after I escape, either. 𝘃𝑚 did not know his nephew particularly well, but he cared enough to deliver a warning. The gift you have, it's ... It's like having a valuable treasure but not being strong enough to protect it. Like when Tsubasa took my crown, Izuku muttered. He nodded. I won't tell. Good. 𝘃𝑚 squeezed his nephew's hand. First off, I need you to contact my husbands. I have more uncles. Izuku shrieked. How many? The boy's enthusiasm made 𝘃𝑚 smile sincerely, for the first time that night. Yes, just 2. Next time you return, I'll tell you all about them. It couldn't hurt to have an extra incentive. 𝘃𝑚 very much feared being left here all alone. Got it. Izuku jiggled with excitement. Escape plan first. 𝘃𝑚 said, I had a magical treasure that I used to contact my husbands when I was locked up in the palace before, back when we were boyfriends. I'm certain my brother still keeps it, since he preserved all my belongings when he believed I was dead. It's a hollow book with a cover made of gold and emeralds. When you put a letter inside, it will vanish and reappear inside the book owned by my husbands. 𝘃𝑚 had been forced to leave the priceless enchanted book behind because he couldn't exactly pack a bag when he was faking his death. He didn't think 𝘃𝑚 had ever realized what the fake book could do. Izuku gasped and put his hands to his cheeks. I know that book. My daddy gave it to me for a birthday present. He gave me a lot of your old belongings. 𝘃𝑚 nearly leapt to his feet, stopping just before he slammed his head into the roof of the cage. That's amazing. 𝘠ⴇ But it was stolen by our mean movers. They took away everything with jewels. Shit. 𝘃𝑚 winced. Don't repeat that word. Why did he have no luck? Was it bad karma because he was manipulating an innocent child? Izuku said, I can try to find it. It had to be one of the movers who stole it. I just don't think they'll want to give it back. Stealing is an option. Have you ever stolen before? 𝘃𝑚 sighed at his nephew's blank expression. Perhaps I can teach you. We'll start by figuring out who has the book. Izuku said, Mommy was very angry. She's been trying to get our stuff back. Maybe she knows. You could ask her ... but don't tell her about me. Why not? 𝘃𝑚 had nothing but contempt for the woman who had married his brother for power and offered up her own child as a twisted replacement doll. But he could hardly admit that to Izuku, especially not the part where he suspected the boy's mother of wanting to kill him. Because we don't want her to know about our escape plan, so she can't be blamed if we fail. He wondered if it had been a mistake to remind Izuku that his request could be dangerous. But Izuku only nodded. You're right. Better if only I get in trouble. The boy might be spoiled, but he was no coward. 𝘃𝑚 said, after you deliver the letter, then we'll arrange a time for my husbands to come rescue me. Namely, sometime when 𝘃𝑚 isn't at the palace. We'll need you to take down the wards around the basement at just the right moment, but too early so no one finds out. My husbands will take me away and no one will know that you had anything to do with it. If it went to plan, Izuku shouldn't be connected to the escape. No one else knew about his gift. 𝘃𝑚 didn't want to risk a child, but he was desperate. He couldn't spend the rest of eternity trapped in this small cage. Death would be a kindness in comparison. 𝘃𝑚 told himself that Izuku would be much less at risk than anyone else in the palace. 𝘃𝑚 would kill anyone who helped 𝘃𝑚, but he wouldn't kill family. The Demon King was far too possessive. Izuku was only a 5-year-old child and wouldn't be punished too harshly no matter what. Closing his eyes, Izuku mumbled under his breath. 𝘃𝑚 leaned closer but couldn't hear. Finally he asked, Izuku. Oh. Izuku jumped. I was thinking about how to get the book. 𝘃𝑚 liked that kind of initiative. Then we have a deal. He held out his hand. Izuku shook. The boy hadn't noticed that the deal really only benefited 𝘃𝑚. Ever since he'd been Izuku's age, 𝘃𝑚 had specialized in tricking people into one-sided deals. Maybe this would be a valuable lesson for Izuku about trusting strangers. You should leave now, 𝘃𝑚 said with reluctance. You can't risk being caught here when my brother returns, even though he hated being left alone again. Izuku nodded. I'll come back as soon as I can sneak out again. You can tell me about my other uncles. Please do. 𝘃𝗟𝗃's plea came out a little too desperate. He smiled to cover it up. I greatly enjoyed talking to you. This won him a small, shy smile in return. As Izuku turned and left, 𝘃𝗟 was filled with fear that the boy would never come back. Izuku might change his mind, or he might get caught. This might be the last time that 𝘃𝗟 ever heard another voice besides his older brother's poison. The little bit of hope that 𝘃𝗟 currently had felt painful. It had been easier when he'd given up on seeing his home and his husbands again. Now he had a chance at escape. He also knew fear. He couldn't screw this up. He couldn't endure eternity caged by his demented brother. 𝘃𝗟's cell door flashed colors like a rainbow. Then the wards vanished. With a grinding sound, the metal door opened. The artificial sun turned on. The instant 𝘆𝑚 stepped through the door, 𝘃𝗟 tensed. He was terrified that his older brother might have some magical means of telling that someone else had been in this room. It didn't seem likely. Why would 𝘆𝑚 bother when he'd cast powerful magic to ensure no one else could enter? To cover up the expression on his face, 𝘃𝗟 rolled over and pretended to be asleep. 𝘆𝑚's footsteps made their way over. He didn't seem to have noticed Izuku's visit. If he had, he'd be throwing a fit. Reaching through the cage, 𝘆𝑚 yanked off 𝘃𝗟's blanket. Rise and shine, little brother. 𝘆𝑚 was one of those dreadful people who were cheerful in the morning, which was reason number 999 why he deserved to die. Groaning, 𝘃𝗟 rolled over and pulled his pillow over his head. Due to limited space, his feet bumped against the bars. I brought breakfast. 𝘆𝑚 waved the tray near 𝘃𝗟's face. The scent of miso soup and salmon drifted over. You'll feel like a proper demon once you have some food in you. Are you going to eat this or will you make me force you again? 𝘃𝗟 hesitated. He no longer had any desire to hunger strike. That had come from a place of despair, spite, and sincere desire to die. Now that he had an escape plan, it would be wiser to keep up his strength. He'd already lost enough weight because the bounty hunters had stopped taking off his muzzle to feed him because he kept biting. But would it look suspicious if he gave in too easily? Even so, 𝘃𝗟 hated the force feeding so much that he could not bear to speak the words that would condemn himself to it again. Since he took too long to reply, the decision was made for him. 𝘆𝑚 opened the cage door and grabbed 𝘃𝗟's hair, magic jolting through his touch. A tingling ran through 𝘃𝗟's body. Then his arms and legs went slack. Against his own will, he sat up. 𝘆𝑚 offered him a hand to help him out of the cage. 𝘃𝗟 would have rather bit off his own wrist than accepted, but his hand moved on its own. This ability allowed 𝘆𝑚 to control 𝘃𝗟's body. 𝘃𝗟 absolutely hated it. He already felt like his brother's doll. To be moved around against his will was the shit frosting on top of the shit cupcake. A fake bush grew upward, unfolding its branches and sprouting a glass table on top. A tulip swelled up and distorted into a purple chair. 𝘃𝗟's legs walked over and sat down. 𝘆𝑚 placed the tray in front of him. It was a traditional breakfast: grilled salmon, rice, miso soup, and sweet omelets. It smelled delicious, but when 𝘃𝗟's mouth chewed each bit of food against his will, he could barely taste his food. The spell had trouble with delicate motions, so his food didn't get chewed enough. He choked down overly large bites. His throat burned, but he could not control his hand to reach for the water glass. If 𝘃𝗟 had been able to talk, he might have broken down and begged the spell to be removed so he could eat on his own. Little tears of pain formed in his eyes. Using a silk handkerchief, 𝘆𝑚 wiped away 𝘃𝗟's tears. Then, after 𝘃𝗟 finished eating, 𝘆𝑚 wiped his mouth. I wouldn't need to do this if you'd only eat like a good child. Control of 𝘃𝗟's body returned to him. He immediately leapt up, batted away the hand, and tried to jump away. But 𝘃𝗟's legs went out from under him. As he started to fall, he flapped his wings. But their movements were slow and weak, too. 𝘆𝑚 caught 𝘃𝗟 before he hit the ground. Oh my, how clumsy. What did you do to me? 𝘃𝗟 demanded. Are you still controlling my body? He desperately hoped his brother hadn't developed a lesser, longer-lasting version of the control spell. If this was a spell, then it hurt. Tingles of pain ran down his legs and wings. You fell on your own, my dear little brother. It looks like your legs and wings cramped up because you've been sitting around all day. A glowing white light flashed from 𝘆𝑚's hands. There, now it won't hurt any longer. The pain stopped, but 𝘃𝗟 couldn't move any better. To his disgust, he was stuck in his older brother's embrace. He should have realized sooner that being trapped in a cage all week would harm his wings, but why didn't I feel the cramps in the cage? His voice was raspy from the damage breakfast had done. If he'd felt the cramps, he could have moved his body more to work them out. Because I spelled your cage so that you wouldn't feel any pain inside. You can't be injured or die. It's an extremely safe space. Even if your head was chopped off, you'd survive in stasis long enough for me to reattach it. 𝘃𝗟 had already noticed that he didn't get hungry or thirsty inside the cage, only outside it, even though he'd always had a weak body. He never coughed or had his usual chest pains. He also didn't need to go to the bathroom. If you could do that, then you could have prevented my wings from getting cramps. 𝘆𝑚 smiled maniacally. Why would I do that when you'd only use them to fly away from me? This is your punishment for letting me believe you were dead for decades. I'll make sure your wings stay in good shape even when you can't fly. They're beautiful, after all. Such a rare treasure. 𝘧𝗓𝗄 petted �ᴑi's hair. You should be grateful that I haven't clipped your wings. Rather than harm a feather on your body, I found a more benevolent way to keep you on the ground. I'll never let anything hurt you, even yourself. �ᴑi froze in terror at the prospect of never being able to fly again. A fresh horror came over him as he took his brother's second meaning. �ᴑi would never be able to self-harm while in the cage. Unable to die, he would be trapped for eternity. While he was still in shock, 𝘧𝗓𝗄 maneuvered them both to the soft ground made of cloth grass. Sitting �ᴑi between his legs, 𝘧𝗓𝗄 started grooming his wings, pulling out loose feathers. By reflex, �ᴑi lashed out with magic. The golden collar around his neck crackled and ached. It had sealed his magic away. �ᴑi tried to physically shove his brother instead. With a flick of 𝘧𝗓𝗄's fingers, glowing white bonds sprang forth and wrapped around �ᴑi's arms and legs. Humming, 𝘧𝗓𝗄 resumed grooming. He ignored the steady stream of curses flowing from �ᴑi's lips. Big Brother had always loved �ᴑi's wings. From the way 𝘧𝗓𝗄 got upset at any trace of damage, one would think that they were his wings. Sometimes �ᴑi got the chilling sense that 𝘧𝗓𝗄 would like to hang his wings on the wall with the trophies of defeated enemies. If it would have worked, 𝘂ᴑi would have severed his own wings for a chance to escape. Alas, his brother was possessive of the rest of him, too. Poor, unfortunate Izuku actually wanted this demented love. The boy was too young to see anything wrong with sitting in his father's lap or being fed. It was only natural for a child to crave his parents' affection. The appeal would have worn off when he'd hit his teens. 𝘂ᴑi muttered, "I'm surprised you didn't smother even a 5-year-old. 𝘂ᴑi didn't realize he'd spoken out loud, until 𝘧𝗓𝗄 replied, "I used to pretend Izuku was you. Sometimes I could convince myself, even though he didn't have the right wings." 𝘧𝗓𝗄 stroked a feather lovingly. "It soothed my pain, but it was never quite the same as having you in my arms. Now I can't stand the sight of him, thinking I wasted so much time on him when I could have been looking for you. You have no need to be jealous." "Jealous? Have you completely lost what little remains of your mind?" 𝘂ᴑi gagged. "You created a child for the purpose of replacing me. That's fucked up. I wouldn't have needed to if you hadn't run away. I wouldn't have left if you weren't fucked up in the head. Such language." 𝘧𝗓𝗄 pinched 𝘂ᴑi's cheek. "Do I need to gag you until I'm done?" 𝘂ᴑi took a deep breath. Izuku had offered to help at 𝘂ᴑi's lowest moment, so 𝘂ᴑi wanted to do something in return. He would need to speak carefully, so as not to reveal the nighttime visit. "Look, I think the kid is better off without you or your twisted love. Also, it would be a problem if 𝘧𝗓𝗄 started acting like he loved his child again and Izuku no longer had a motive to help 𝘂ᴑi. But I saw how you treated your son in the throne room. If you've been rejecting him like that in public, then you're putting him in a precarious position. After the court sees that he no longer has your protection, they'll take everything that belongs to him and bully him for fun. Maybe you never loved your son, but you still have a responsibility toward the child you created. At least instruct the guards to stop anyone from hurting him. Why do you care?" 𝘧𝗓𝗄's voice turned dark. His arms fastened painfully tight around 𝘂ᴑi. "You met the boy once. He's nothing to you. He's my nephew. He's a child, only 5 years old. You threw me away even though I was your only family member." 𝘧𝗓𝗄's grip left bruises on 𝘂ᴑi's hips. "Why would you care about a stranger who shares even less blood with you than me?" "Let go, I can't breathe." 𝘂ᴑi gasped and shoved until the grip loosened. "Only you would be jealous of your own son. Forget it. I only said something because I got awestruck at what a shitty father you are." 𝘂ᴑi could tell that it would do Izuku harm rather than good to keep pressing the topic. He should have known that he had no influence left with his brother to use. "I warned you about your language." 𝘧𝗓𝗄 frowned. With a flick of his magic, 𝘂ᴑi could no longer talk. 𝘂ᴑi seethed in silence. Even after he felt sensation return to his tongue as the spell wore off, there was no point in communicating with Crazy. When the interminable grooming finished, 𝘂ᴑi hoped his brother would leave him alone. Instead, 𝘧𝗓𝗄 picked 𝘂ᴑi up and flung him over one shoulder like a sack of potatoes. "Hey, I can walk," 𝘂ᴑi cried, wriggling. Not with his legs still bound, admittedly. His wings flapped, but he did not have the correct angle to take flight. An extra band of light fastened over them. "Aw, but you're too delicate and fragile after a few days in a cage to even stand up, remember." 𝘧𝗓𝗄 opened the door. 𝘂ᴑi's heart beat with excitement. He briefly imagined that he might get to see the real son for the first time in a week. Instead, 𝘧𝗓𝗄 carried 𝘂ᴑi into his adjacent quarters. In 𝘧𝗓𝗄's private office, 𝘧𝗓𝗄 sat down on a broad armchair and positioned 𝘂ᴑi like a doll in his lap. Then 𝘧𝗓𝗄 took out a paper and started reading. Could this be 𝘂ᴑi's new fate, to be a lapdog while his brother worked? Had he provoked this treatment by making the mistake of rousing his brother's jealousy? Squirming, 𝘂ᴑi snarled, "I would hate to take up the High Lord's valuable time. You can leave me back in my cage. Even the endless solitude is better than you." After so long apart, I want to spend time with my dear little brother. 𝘆_cie tucked 𝘊𝑐𝑠's head under his chin and used it to hold him in place. Alas, I have such pressing business that I can't possibly delay it even a day. Stealing more people's gifts? 𝘊𝑐𝑖 asked. 𝘆_cie's voice dropped to a growl. Looking for the people who faked your death and stole you away. 𝘊𝑐𝑠's heart skipped a beat. He went still. He did not dare show the smallest reaction for fear of betraying even the tiniest clue about his lovers. 𝘊𝑐𝑖 had met 𝘠𴠀 and 𝑠ānzu the first time he'd run away. Fleeing his brother's hunters in the woods, he'd run into two men camping. One with a scar across his face and one with pineapple hair. Or at least they'd claimed to be camping. He later learned they were spies for an enemy nation. They could have turned him over and received a hefty reward as well as access to 𝘆_cie's court. Instead, the two of them had hidden 𝘊𝑐𝑖 and smuggled him out of the country. 𝘠𴠀 was the lord of a small, mountainous domain. His city-state belonged to a larger federation of lords and ladies who had banded together for mutual defense against High Lord 𝘆_cie. Since his lands bordered with 𝗨_――, he constantly saw battle. 𝘠𴠀 had no reason to help the brother of his worst enemy, but he'd still offered 𝘊𝑐𝑖 shelter. Back then, 𝘊𝑐𝑖 had been determined to do everything in his power to halt his brother's expanding empire. 𝘊𝑐𝑖 had gone to the capital of the Federation and volunteered to help the war effort. He had not revealed that 𝘠𴠀 and 𝘆ānzu had helped him escape for fear of bringing down retaliation from his brother, which would later prove to be a wise decision. When 𝘊𝑐𝑖 had joined the Federation army, he'd met 𝘠𴠀 and 𝘆ānzu again. 𝘠𴠀 liked to say he'd fallen in love the first time that he'd seen 𝘊𝑐𝑖 rip out the heart of a Leviathan demon. They'd made an unstoppable team on the battlefield. 𝘠𴠀 and 𝘆ānzu had already been married, so it had taken 𝘊𝑐𝑖 a while to realize that his two devastatingly attractive friends were courting him. In 𝘊𝑐𝑖's defense, 𝘠𴠀's idea of a courting present was a severed head. If not for 𝘆ānzu, they might have never gotten past the pining stage. 𝘆ānzu had taken control of the situation by kissing 𝘠𴠀 and then asking if 𝘊𝑐𝑖 wanted one, too. In retrospect, it had been a good thing that 𝘠𴠀 was such a disaster at romance, because it meant that 𝘆_cie's spies never found out. Most people in the army had thought that �12 hated the brother of his worst enemy because he kept throwing severed heads at 𝘊𝑐𝑖's tent. 𝘆_ciehad had gone into a mad frenzy at the sight of his little brother fighting for the other side. He'd offered a tempting concession of territory and a peace treaty in exchange for 𝘊𝑐𝑖's return. Then he'd taken prisoners as hostages. A sizable faction of the Federation nobility had wanted to hand 𝘊𝑐𝑖 over. He'd been prepared to flee. Before the decision had been made, 𝘊𝑐𝑖 had been sent to battle in a front lines position. He had a strong suspicion that a deal had been cut behind the scenes, because most of his troop had abandoned him and his brother had recaptured him. 𝘊𝑐𝑖's previous life with his brother had been difficult. 𝘆_cie, enraged from his little brother's abandonment, had turned into a monster, locking 𝘊𝑐𝑖 up in a lightless metal room. 𝘊𝑐𝑖 had faked compliance just to get a bedroom for a prison. When he played along, his older brother would let him have books to read. Using their spies, 𝘠𴠀 and 𝘆ānzu had snuck in an enchanted hollow book. The magic let them materialize letters inside. They'd set up a plan to fake 𝘊𝑐𝑖's death and free him from his possessive brother for once and for all. Aided by several servants who wanted a new home and freedom from 𝗨_―, 𝘊𝑐𝑖 had escaped. They'd arranged a chase up a mountain and used complicated illusion magic to make it look like 𝘊𝑐𝑖 had fallen into an active volcano. With the help of an extremely powerful transformation potion, 𝘊𝑐𝑖 had become Kazuki, the petite and pink-haired new husband of Lord 𝘠𴠀 and Lord 𝘆ānzu. His rare white wings had turned red and scaly. He'd sacrificed his beautiful face for a round, cute one. No one except the three of them knew. After his last betrayal, 𝘊𝑐𝑖 had realized that too many people in the Federation would hand him over to his brother. Only in presumed death could he be free. 𝘆_cie had been suspicious at first about the lack of body, but as years turned into decades, 𝘆_cie had seemed to give up. Even if he never removed his bounty on 𝘊𝑐𝑖's capture, 𝘊𝑐𝑖 never took off his disguise, except in the privacy of the royal bedroom. He might have continued with this masquerade forever if he hadn't gotten a bad potion. The seller had poorly prepared the mandrake. 𝘊𝑐𝑖 had been away on a diplomatic visit to a neighboring domain when he'd started to transform back in the middle of a ballroom. He'd fled into the forest before anyone had noticed, racked with sickness from the tainted potion. He'd vomited until he passed out. Unfortunately, his unconscious body had been found by a group of bounty hunters. Even more unfortunately, they'd recognized the face of the legendary highest bounty. As a small mercy, because he'd been in a foreign land, no one had connected him with 𝘠𴠀 and 𝘆ānzu. Though on the other hand, if he'd been home when he'd transformed, then he never would have been captured. If 𝘊𝑐𝑖 could escape again, then he still had a chance to return to his old identity. 𝘆_cie did not yet know his fake name. If 𝘠𴠀 and 𝘆ānzu could keep their faces hidden during the rescue, then they would be home free. Even if he'd had no hope of escape, 𝘊𝑐𝑖 would never let his brother find out about his husbands. 𝘆_cie would bestow a fate worse than death on anyone who'd helped 𝘊𝑐𝑖 stay free. He would send assassins and armies. Would you like to see my list of suspects? 𝘆_cie waved a paper under 𝘃ici's face. 𝘃ici desperately wanted to know if 𝘆_cie suspected his husbands, but he didn't dare look. Even if he kept his face blank, his brother would be watching for any flinch or quickening of breath. 𝘃ici squeezed his eyes shut. 𝘆_cie said, if I can't find the culprits, I'll kill everyone. You'd save countless lives by loosening that sharp tongue of yours a little. I'll show mercy if you tell me voluntarily. What an insultingly transparent lie. 𝘃ici didn't grace it with a reply. 𝘆_cie started reading the names on the list out loud. It was a very long list. Since he seemed to be naming every single enemy lord, Kaiji's name would definitely be on there. 𝘆_cie's hand fastened on his little brother's wrist, checking for the slightest change in pulse. 𝘃ici felt a tingle of magic in the air. If 𝘆_cie was using a gift to monitor his emotions, then that cut off any chance to fake a reaction and cast false suspicion on one of 𝘆_cie's minions. Grinding his teeth, 𝘃ici tried very hard not to listen. He tried to go away in his head. He imagined that the arms around him belonged to Sanzu, the taller of his two husbands. Sanzu had spiky hair that he liked to wear in a ponytail and dye different colors. He considered himself the practical one of the trio and usually looked stoic, but 𝘃ici loved charming smiles out of him. Instead of his brother monitoring his pulse, 𝘃ici tried to imagine that Kaiji was holding his hand. Kaiji had spiky hair, a long scar across his nose, and a serious case of resting bitch face. Underneath his gruff exterior, he was one of the kindest demons that 𝘃ici knew. 𝘃ici loved to tease Kaiji until his face cracked and he blushed. 𝘃ici imagined that he was safe at home and taking a nap while Kaiji and Sanzu spoke in the background. It would be perfectly normal to hear their voices. If he heard their names, it would be nothing worth reacting to. He was peaceful and happy. 𝘃ici drifted away into his illusion. When he heard a very familiar lord's name, he did not twitch from his state of semi-slumber. After finishing his list, 𝘆_cie sighed. None of them? Should I suspect even my closest allies now? A very small sigh escaped 𝘃ici's lips, a mixture of relief and triumph. 𝘆_cie chuckled. His grip tightened on 𝘃ici's wrist. I felt that, little brother. So your ally was someone on that list. 𝘃ici could have screamed his throat raw. He tried not to react. Big brother might not yet be certain. Despite all 𝘃ici's best attempts, he could no longer return to his still, calm state. He was panicking, and he felt certain his brother knew it. 𝘆_cie forced 𝘃ici to stay in his lap as he finished all his paperwork. 𝘃ici tried his hardest not to break down crying. It felt impossible to breathe, like there was a leviathan resting its tail on his chest. When 𝘆_cie finally finished, he carried 𝘃ici back over to the birdcage. After he locked the door, he vanished the bonds on 𝘃ici's limbs. With one last pat on his brother's feathery wings, 𝘆_cie said, I'll return for your next meal. I need to instruct my agents. Thanks to you, I know where to start looking. With a sickly sweet smile, he added, when I find out who helped you, I'll make you eat their hearts. When his brother finally left, 𝘃ici broke down sobbing. He hated himself for that tiny sigh at the end. He'd come so close, and he'd failed his lovers. That threat had not been a joke or bluff. His pain and sorrow turned into rage. In a mad frenzy, 𝘃ici beat at the bars of his golden cage. Let me out of here. Let me out. 𝘃ici had to warn Kaiji and Sanzu. He wanted to go home. Desperately, he craved to be wrapped in his lover's wings. He could not endure the horror of living in this tiny cage forever. Death would be preferable, but he knew his brother would never allow him to die. He couldn't live like this. He'd do anything to get out. He tried to retreat back into his illusion of home, as he often did when locked up alone, but he no longer had the necessary control. Wild emotions swirled inside of him. He kept beating against the cage until he collapsed from exhaustion. Curled up in a ball, 𝘃ici whispered, Please, I want to go home. Izuku's heart burst with joy at his very important mission. Yesterday, Izuku had been a discarded prince with a father who no longer loved him and friends turned bullies who'd always secretly resented him. Today, Izuku was a hero on a noble mission to save his gentle uncle from wrongful imprisonment. Just a small change in perspective made him feel like he could get out of bed and face the world. That morning, Izuku had asked his mother if they might get back their stolen belongings, in particular his favorite book with an emerald cover. He did not tell her about his secret mission. He had promised his uncle. With a small smile, 𝘆𝑥 had revealed that she'd cast a curse on their belongings to find their way back to their rightful owners. 𝘆𝑥 specialized in magic that pulled items to her. It was considered a minor gift, but she'd honed it until she could cause pain and misfortune to anyone who stole from her. Izuku had asked to help. 𝘆𝑥 told him that he could deliver some letters to their larcenous movers, suggesting that the accidents and nightmares would stop the faster they returned the stolen goods. Now Izuku flew down the corridor holding a letter close to his chest. He'd already delivered all but one. A rock bounced off Izuku's wing. He was inexperienced with flying. His wing bent, and before he could right himself, he flew into the wall. In a huddled heap on the floor, Izuku whispered, Oh. He'd hit his nose on the wall. His scraped knees also throbbed. Oops, my hand slipped, 𝘂𝘶 called mockingly. The boy with red wings landed next to 𝘂𝘶. He kicked 𝘂𝘶's leg. I slipped again. As soon as the two boys made contact, a jolt ran through 𝘂𝘶's nervous system straight up his spine. He knew instinctively that he could steal 𝘂𝘶's gift if only he removed the tiny barrier of cloth stopping their skin from touching. It was only a minor power, but 𝘂𝘶 craved it like water on a hot day. He could nearly taste the sparkly magic on his tongue. As if in a trance, 𝘂𝘶's hand reached forward. Then 𝘂𝘶 stopped himself. No one could yet know that he had the ability to break into his uncle's prison. That would ruin his top secret mission. 𝘂𝘶 leapt to his feet, grabbed his letter, and ran down the hallway. His wings stung, but as soon as he had enough momentum, he took flight again. 𝘂𝘶 called after him, "Yeah, you should run." The bully had no idea that 𝘂𝘶 was running from his own urges to steal that lovely, shining gift. 𝘂𝘁 had been unable to fall asleep that night, desperately hoping that 𝘂𝘶 would return. Staring into the darkness, his head throbbed from exhaustion. At the first noise from the door, 𝘂𝘁 whirled to look. The artificial sun turned on as 𝘂𝘶 stepped into the room. "Sorry for waking you up, Uncle 𝘂𝘁." 𝘂𝘁 sighed from relief. "I wasn't asleep. Thank you for coming." "Just, thank you." Embarrassing tears stung the corners of his eyes. Running over, 𝘂𝘶 reached through the bars and held 𝘂𝘁's hand. "Are you hurt?" "Not physically," 𝘂𝘁 muttered. He rubbed his eyes. "I'm just very glad to see you." "Really, really?" 𝘂𝘶 looked surprised and a little overwhelmed to have received such a warm welcome. "Hey, what about you?" 𝘂𝘁 peered through the bars, noticing the bruise on his nephew's nose. "What happened to your face?" 𝘂𝘶 looked away. "I fell down." 𝘂𝘁 growled low in the back of his throat. "Someone pushed you." 𝘂𝘶's wings drooped. "Huh, Mom didn't believe me either. If it weren't for this cursed collar, I could heal you." 𝘂𝘁 tugged at the gold welded tight to his neck. He'd never been as gifted with magic as his older brother, but he at least knew spells to ease pain. Once, when they'd been younger and innocent, 𝘆𝘶 had put a bit of his own power into 𝘂𝘁. He'd used this to absorb the wards and bust out of his prison the first time, but this time Big Brother hadn't underestimated him so much and had sealed his magic away. Did those bad people hurt you anywhere else? From his own rough childhood, 𝘂𝘁 knew how clothing could hide bruises. "I'm just a little scraped up. I told Mom not to worry. She shouldn't lose her jewelry for another doctor visit. She hasn't much left." 𝘂𝘶 shuffled his feet. In a softer voice, he said, "I made her cry." 𝘂𝘁 could also empathize very well with that guilt. When he'd been small and weak, his big brother had taken injuries to protect him. "Let me cast a spell on you." 𝘂𝘁 laid a hand on the top of 𝘂𝘶's head. "You're a brave hero, so you no longer feel pain." Okay, it sounded a bit lame, but hopefully it would have the desired psychological effect. 𝘂𝘶 gasped. "I feel better now." 𝘂𝘁 patted the soft curls again. "I'm very happy that you're helping me, 𝘂𝘶. I feel much better now that you're here. You've saved me. You're not weak or useless." 𝘂𝘶 puffed out his chest. "That's right. I could have stolen 𝘂𝘶's gift, but I didn't because I have a secret mission. That was a wise choice. It would be dangerous if your father knew what you can do." 𝘂𝘁's eyes narrowed. "So the brat is named 𝘂𝘶." He added the name to his shit list. "Even if you can't steal his gift, you can still get revenge on him in other ways." 𝘂𝘶 said, "I was going to mail him a box of spiders." "Excellent idea." 𝘂𝘁 nodded. "Let's go bigger. Have you ever heard of throat spiders?" "No. They live in people's throats and render them unable to talk." 𝘂𝘁 grinned wickedly. "I used to have an enchantment to turn regular spiders into throat spiders. You said that you have a lot of my old belongings. Do you have a black box with a red spider on the front?" 𝘂𝘶 nodded. "Yeah. The movers didn't steal that because it's not shiny. Put your spiders in the box for an hour, and they'll turn into throat spiders. Make sure you don't touch them after the transformation. They infect people by skin contact." 𝘂𝘶 puffed up his cheeks indignantly, which only made him look cuter. "Of course I won't. Be careful not to touch 𝘂𝘶 after he's infected too. They're highly contagious. Your bully will probably be quarantined after his infection, so he won't be able to go near you anytime soon. After he gets well, he might come after you for revenge. I'd suggest an anonymous gift." 𝘂𝘶 stomped his foot. "Then I'll send him more spiders until he leaves me alone." 𝘂𝘁 laughed. "You've got spirit." He respected that. This kid was a lot braver than he first seemed. 𝘂𝘁 could see the family resemblance now. "You got your stubbornness from me. I used to get beat up as a kid because I couldn't keep my mouth shut. I have scars, but no regrets." "Ooh." 𝘂𝘶's eyes widened. "Did people think you were too weak to be a prince too?" "I wasn't a prince. My brother and I were poor orphans, until he took over his first domain. I'm guessing that 𝘆𝘶 doesn't let people talk about that these days. He has too much pride." 𝘂𝘁 shook his head. Personally, he thought it far more impressive that his brother had worked his way up from the bottom than if he'd been born royal. But Big Brother didn't want anyone to know that he'd once eaten scraps from the trash can. "You're not too weak to be a prince. If people say that, it's only because they don't know about your gift." You have a rare and amazing power. Izuku looked down. I'm not very strong or brave. You're the bravest kid I know. Not that 𝘃_ᴑ knew many kids, but that was besides the point. You snuck down here to see me. That was brave. You promised to help save me. That was even braver. This won a quick smile from Izuku. I asked Mom about getting our stuff back. Quickly, Izuku explained about his mother's abilities and her plan to curse the objects until they return. With a sigh, 𝘃_ᴑ leaned back against the bars of his cage. It was good news, but he didn't want to wait for the movers to return the stolen belongings on their own. He was desperate to contact his husbands right away, before they did something rash. Kaiji would be at the gates of 𝗷𝗏 palace already if Sanzu hadn't restrained him. Though, he wanted me to get the book faster. Izuku looked up from under his eyelashes. I could try to steal it. No, that's too risky. 𝘃_ᴑ hated to wait. Every single second in his brother's loathsome presence was an agony. But a 5-year-old wouldn't make a very skilled thief. If anyone realized something was special about the book, then 𝘃_ᴑ's one and only chance at escape would be ruined. It would be smarter to wait, no matter how agonizing it felt. The tips of his wings trembled. Mom's magic is strong. It shouldn't take long, Izuku said, speaking with odd gentleness coming from a child toward an adult. What should I write when I find the book? Tell them that you're my nephew and you're helping me. Secretly, 𝘃_ᴑ knew that if Izuku admitted to being 𝗷𝗏's son, this would clue in Kaiji and Sanzu that they needed to keep their identities secret in their replies. Tell them that you can bring down the wards on my cell, and you'll do it the first time that 𝗷_1 is away from the palace. Please ask them to come close but not try to rescue me before then. And please, send the letter as soon as you find the book. You don't need to talk to me first. They need to know about the plan as soon as possible. Otherwise they might do something stupid. 𝘃_ᴑ had regular nightmares about his husband's dying for him. Izuku nodded. I'll remember what you told me, I promise. He jiggled, his wings dancing. I won't let you down. I'll save you and turn everything back to normal. 𝘃_ᴑ really hoped so. He'd do anything to escape his fate worse than death. He wanted to believe that things would turn out better for this kid with him gone. He felt a pang of guilt at the thought of Izuku being disappointed if 𝘃_ᴑ didn't turn back to him as a substitute. But on second thought, it would be better if his monstrously possessive brother continued to stay away. Izuku might want 𝘃_ᴑ's love now, but in the long run he would be happier not ending up like 𝘃_ᴑ. You look sad. Izuku pouted. You don't believe I can do it. No, that's not why. I was just remembering some sad stuff. 𝘃_ᴑ yawned. You should probably go back to bed, he said reluctantly. You're a growing boy. You need your rest. He smiled, trying to paint a bright face over his pain. He did not think he'd be able to sleep tonight, alone in his cage. I'll come visit you every night, Izuku said, proving his perceptiveness once again. 𝘃_ᴑ ought to tell Izuku not to come again until he found the book. Each visit was a risk. Instead, he said, thank you. The next time Izuku snuck out at night and opened the basement door, he saw light at the bottom of the stairway. The artificial sun in Uncle 𝘃_ᴑ's room was turned on. Only one other person could visit that room. Izuku had a brief, mad desire to run downstairs and see his father. Daddy hadn't gone near him in so long that it had left a gaping open wound in his chest. But even at age 5, Izuku was not that stupid. He closed the door and quietly left. The next night, Izuku came as soon as his mother had fallen asleep. He felt guilty about not visiting last night and failing to keep his promise. Pushing open the door, Izuku called, Are you awake, Uncle 𝘃_ᴑ? He did not step inside. He didn't want to jolt his uncle awake with sudden bright light like last time. I'm awake, 𝘃_ᴑ called, sitting up. His wings rustled in the darkness. The sun turned on as Izuku walked down the pathway to the cage. Uncle 𝘃_ᴑ had grown ethereally pale. His eyes had sunk into his skull. The bagginess of his robe made him look smaller. Even in just 2 days, he'd shrunk into himself. When people in stories died of grief, Izuku had always thought that sounded very implausible. But his uncle looked like someone who might actually vanish like a cry of pain lost in the wind. Hunching his shoulders, 𝘃_ᴑ whispered, It's not safe here. My brother visited me last night, and he might again. I should never have asked you to come. I'm sorry. It's okay. Izuku cracked a small smile. Daddy left the palace. Here, you should eat something. I was worried about if you were eating with Daddy gone. Izuku held out a loaf of bread and a water bottle that he'd tucked under his arm. 𝘃_ᴑ gripped the bars of his cage. 𝘃_ᴑ is gone. Why? Where? I'll tell you while you eat, Izuku insisted, holding out the bread. With a rueful grimace, 𝘃_ᴑ took the offered food. The shriekers came by to feed me, but I didn't have any appetite. I thought my brother was punishing me with solitude, but you say he's no longer at the palace. 𝘃_ᴑ took a huge bite of bread. Izuku asked, Do you remember the throat spiders? Wiping away the crumbs on his mouth, 𝘃_ᴑ grinned. Yes, did they work? Tsubasa couldn't say anything except tarantula hissing. Izuku giggled. Tsubasa infected his grandfather, and Lord Garaki infected half the nobles at court, including my father. 𝘃_ᴑ whooped and clapped. Spectacular. You are the best, most brilliant nephew ever. No wonder 𝘆𝘂 left without saying goodbye to me. He wouldn't want me to see him unable to talk. He knows I'd mock him relentlessly. Izuku said. Daddy officially left court on a hunting trip for 2 weeks, but everyone guesses that he got infected. Mom was laughing about it over dinner tonight. 𝘃𝑚 nodded. The throat spiders feed off magic. If 𝘆𝘂 wants to get rid of them, then he can't use magic for 2 weeks. That's why he has to avoid his own court. They're incurable, no matter how many gifts my brother has. In fact, if he uses his magic, then it will reset his 2-week timeline. That will teach him. Talk about going hunting for a sparrow and catching a hawk. No one suspects you, right? Nope. I was going to tell Tsubasa what I did to teach him not to mess with me. But after Daddy got sick, I thought better about taking responsibility. I'm glad you thought fast on your feet. You did good, kid. 𝘃𝑚 bit his lip. With my brother gone, this seems like the perfect chance to escape. Have you heard anything about my enchanted book? Izuku said. Mommy tracked down most of our belongings. The movers took them to a broker named Jiren, asking him to remove her curse. She says he won't be able to get rid of it, and then they'll be forced to give back our stuff. Do you want me sneak into Jiren's shop and look for your book? 𝘃𝑚 sighed. I'm tempted, but it's too risky. My brother should be safely gone for 2 weeks. That's time enough for you to get my book back the safe way. 𝘃𝑚 took a long sip from the water bottle. Waiting is such a bad time. 𝘃𝑚 glanced at Izuku, who was listening to him eagerly. He coughed. Anyway, thank you for letting me know. And thanks for coming to see me. You don't know how much that means to me. Izuku pulled out a deck of cards from his pocket. I brought a game for us to play. 𝘃𝑚's eyes lit up. Yes, your uncle plays a mean game of Devil's Hand, just so you know. In fact, it doesn't seem entirely fair for me to play against you. Have you ever heard of the cooperative version of Devil's Hand? I've never played it at all, Izuku admitted. In the cooperative version, we win or lose together. Come over here and I'll show you. Izuku crouched down and pressed against the bars of the cage, listening. The first couple games, Izuku wasn't very good. He noticed that when they lost, his uncle always said interesting words but kept cutting himself off before finishing them. Izuku assumed these must be grown-up words. It seemed very unfair that grown-ups had a special set of cool-sounding words that they kept all to themselves. Izuku was determined to uncover all the secret words. He listened carefully whenever his uncle swore, trying to piece together the muffled bits. So far, Izuku had learned the words fuck, shit, and bastard. Just as they had almost completed the Devil's Hand, Izuku lied, I'm out of cards. It looks like we lose. Motherfu, 𝘃𝑚 cut himself off. Haha, don't worry your adorable little head about it. Want to play again? Oops, I had one more card left. Izuku put it down. Full hand. He grinned, pleased both at winning the cooperative game and at the cool new word he'd successfully tricked his uncle into teaching him. Based on having already learned the word fuck, the correct ending must be motherfucker. Motherfucker. What a neat word. Izuku loved how it rolled off the tongue. 𝘃𝑚 snorted. You did that on purpose, didn't you? Who, me? Izuku widened his eyes in a way that used to trick his tutors. Uncle 𝘃𝑚 didn't look fooled. He swept up the cards. Trickery is a good trait for a card player to have. Next time I'll teach you the competitive version. When I'm done with you, you'll be winning the allowance off all the other kids. You should head back to bed now. Izuku pouted. One more game. Don't use those innocent eyes on me. A growing boy needs his sleep. No one else will play with me anymore, Izuku mumbled. His friends had all vanished and even his mom was too busy. 𝘃𝑚's gaze softened. Don't let those meanies get you down. I'll play with you again tomorrow night, I promise. Izuku perked up, his good humor restored at the discovery of a new secret word. What did end in? What word started with H? As Izuku skipped up the stairs and back to bed, he continued to ponder. Assoop. That didn't sound right. Assot. Assabit. Assop. Assem. Assart. That sounded like it might mean someone with a mean heart. That could be right. What about Assarpy? Everyone said that harpies were the meanest beasts in the forest. That must be it. Assarpy. Now there was the coolest new word yet. Izuku kept visiting his uncle every single night. 𝘃𝑚 taught him how to play half a dozen different card games and how to cheat. Also, 𝘃𝑚 had the coolest stories about his other 2 uncles and their adventures. They lived high up in the mountains where Uncle 𝘃𝑚 said flying was the best. It made Izuku long to leave the palace, too. In the daytime, everyone treated him coldly. His mother was perpetually sad and tired. Nighttime became the best time for Izuku. It made Izuku sad to think that Uncle 𝘃𝑚 would leave. But he didn't want his uncle to be trapped and unhappy either. It was for the best. Then everything would go back to normal. His usual bedroom would replace this creepy garden and terrifying birdcage. His father would love him again. Right. As 𝘃𝑚 shuffled the deck of cards, Izuku said, tell me another story. Of course, 𝘃𝑚 said. How about a story about me and your father when we were children? 𝘃𝑚 made a point of telling Izuku embarrassing stories about 𝘆𝘂. Not only did 𝘆_cie deserve it, hopefully Izuku would come to see that he didn't need the love of such a colossal numbskull. Did I ever tell you about the first time your father stole a gift? No. Izuku sat up straighter on his knees. His eyes gleamed. Is it a heroic story? Did he fight a terrible enemy? Nah, it was a total accident. Big brother was mocking a girl who had developed a gift, causing her to shed slime all over. The girl slapped my brother, who totally deserved it, and he accidentally stole her gift. Then he hid in his bed for a week and cried because he thought he'd exude slime forever. 𝘂𝗟 couldn't help adding, see, he's not as great as he pretends to be. He doesn't deserve a cute son like you. Izuku looked away and changed the subject. Will you tell me more about my other uncles? He loved hearing stories about Kaiji and Sanzu and asked for more nearly every night. Of course, 𝘂𝗟 thought about what he could say that wouldn't give away Kaiji and Sanzu's identities. Nothing about their physical appearances or status. Your second uncle is known for being a deadly warrior, but he's also a total meathead. When he wanted to court me, he kept giving me different weapons. I thought he was insulting me by implying that I didn't maintain my weapons well enough. It didn't help that he kept scowling at me. It took me a while to realize that his face just looks like that. Izuku giggled. 𝘂𝗟 continued. Your third uncle is good at everything. He can forge weapons, fight, cook, sew, and come up with the most brilliant plans. If not for him, we'd all have died countless times. And he doesn't hesitate to remind us. He likes to grumble that he must have had bad karma in a past life to have been saddled with two morons in this one. But we know he loves us way too much to ever leave. Izuku's face fell. Not even if he met someone better than you two. 𝘂𝗟 winced, realizing that he'd tread on sensitive ground. He leaned down to meet Izuku's eyes. You're talking about your father, aren't you? Izuku shrugged, twirling a lock of hair. I'm not better than you, kid. I promise. I was just here first. He couldn't love both of us? Izuku asked. 𝘂𝗟 hesitated, seeking the right words. 𝘆_cie has always been self-centered. Ever since we were kids, he has to have everything. He wants everyone else's gifts. He wants power. I don't think he can truly love anyone. Not in the sense of putting someone else first. But Daddy used to be so kind to me, Izuku whispered. 𝘂𝗟 said, even when 𝘆_cie loves, it's all about himself. Look at me. He waved across the fake garden. My brother pretends to love me, but he locked me up down here where I can't fly or see the sun. I'd hate that. 𝘆_cie did this to me so that he could always see me whenever he wanted to. Everything is all about himself. When he showered you with gifts, he was also doing it for himself, trying to live out our past childhood again through you. He dropped you as soon as you stopped being useful to him. It was selfish. Daddy never loved me? Izuku asked, tears starting to fall. 𝘂𝗟 reached through the bars to brush the tears away. 𝘆_cie loved you as much as he was capable of. But his love is worth shit. I mean, it's not worth much. This isn't a fault in you, Izuku. It's a fault in 𝘆_cie. You didn't fail him. He failed you as a parent. 𝘂𝗟 wasn't sure if he was getting through it all. This might be too complicated for a child to understand. Look, I'm sure your mom. 𝘂𝗟 started to say that Izuku's mother still loved him, but 𝘂𝗟 had no idea if 𝘆𝑚 loved her child or only wanted to use him as a political tool. He'd never met the woman, but he knew all about his brother's horrific ability to pick them. He didn't want to offer false hope. You're a brave and wonderful boy who is worthy of love. Do you love me? Izuku asked through teary eyes. Damn, what a question to ask when they'd only just met. 𝘂𝗟 felt like he was standing on the edge of a cliff being buffeted by wind too strong to fly in. He was very fond of Izuku, but it had only been a week. That was rather soon to love someone. He instinctively knew that if he gave the wrong answer, the honest answer, it would destroy this kid. Izuku couldn't take another rejection after being abandoned by his father, and 𝘂𝗟 just couldn't bring himself to do it. You're my nephew. I love you. 𝘂𝗟 had lied many times in the past to save himself, but he didn't like lying about love. Perhaps he could act as if his lie was the truth. They were family, and this child desperately needed someone to step up for his sake. Izuku beamed and hugged 𝘂𝗟, his tiny body pressing close to the bars. I love you too, Uncle 𝘂𝗟. Children loved so easily. After Izuku had left, 𝘂𝗟 remembered that Izuku's entire motive for helping him had been to get his father's love back. It had been foolish of 𝘂𝗟 to try and convince his nephew to stop chasing after 𝘆_cie's love. He hadn't acted in his own best interests there. But when 𝘂𝗟 remembered the small smile that had returned to Izuku's face in the end, he couldn't bring himself to regret it. Izuku's eyes felt heavy and his head ached as he rushed down the palace hallway. Today, 𝘆𝑚 had finally refused to let Izuku play sick any longer and insisted that he attend school, since Izuku was staying out at night with 𝘂𝗟. He felt exhausted every day, but he refused to give up his nightly visits. They were the only time he got to interact with someone besides his mother, who treated him with kindness, and his uncle clearly craved the visits too. Also, Izuku had learned 2 new words, bitch and dick. He would soon collect a complete set of grown-up words. In the days before, a gaping gap in reality that he could barely think about without it hurting, Izuku used to have private tutors. Now he attended classes with a large group of other children around the castle. The other kids pointed and whispered at him. His teacher had accused Izuku of being too full of himself for correcting a mistake in a math problem. At the end of class, a girl had stolen Izuku's backpack. He had a feeling he was going to need to catch more spiders. "I'm home," Izuku called as he pushed open the apartment door. _ᴅᴇ was looking at a bill with her forehead wrinkled. As soon as Izuku entered, she put it away and smiled. "How was your first day at your new school?" "It was great. I like attending classes with other kids. I made a couple friends already." Izuku couldn't let his mother worry any more than she already did, so he lied. "How wonderful, sweetie. What are their names?" ᴅᴇ's eyes narrowed. "Where is your backpack?" Izuku needed a distraction. "Look, Mom." He pulled out a paper and held it up. "My teacher wants me to join the young demon army. He says I'd be a great candidate something. Isn't that where big brother Tamura went? I could see him again." Back when Tamura had lived in the palace, Izuku had protected the older boy from bullies a few times. Back then, Izuku had been the powerful crown prince and Tamura had been the son of a traitor. Despite their age gap, they'd been friends. They still kept in touch through letters. Now Izuku hoped that Tamura might be willing to protect him in return if they met again. At the least, it would be great if Tamura didn't decide to hate him like everyone else. Plus, there had been a mention of money for enlisting. And Izuku knew his mother needed that even though she kept trying to hide it. ᴅᴇ's lower lip shook. Her eyes widened with horror. Bursting into tears, she flung her arms around Izuku. Through her sobs, he caught fragments of "no and never and I'll kill them all first." Despite Izuku's best efforts, he'd made his mother cry again. 𝘂𝗟 could tell something was bothering his nephew. Izuku seemed distracted as he shuffled the cards. He yawned, dropping several from the deck. "What's wrong, kid?" 𝘂𝗟 asked. Izuku rubbed his eyes. "I'm a bit tired. Mom sent me to school today. But don't worry, I can still visit because she changed her mind and she's not sending me back there. She said she would teach me herself. I'll get to sleep in for at least a few more days while she makes lesson plans." 𝘂𝗟 frowned. "Did something happen at school?" "I don't know," Izuku admitted. "My teacher wanted me to join the young demon army." Mom flipped out. 𝘂𝗟 grabbed the bars of his cage. "Like absolute hell." Don't repeat that last word." His fingers shook with rage. He wanted to kill Izuku's teacher. He was shocked at his own visceral reaction. This type of pure rage rarely overtook him off the battlefield. Sadly, Izuku said, "Mom said that too, except for the hell part." "Why? What's so bad about it?" "Big brother Tamura is there." 𝘂𝗟 took deep breaths, controlling his anger before it frightened his nephew. "It's too dangerous. I didn't even think they took children as young as you. Big brother is even bigger scum than I realized." "I'm not strong enough?" Izuku asked. His lower lip stuck out. "You're a kid. You shouldn't be fighting, period. The young demon army, they're ... They're trained as spies and infiltrators. They're drawn from orphans and the families of people who offended 𝘆𝘶. In other words, they're expendable. They get sent out on missions and they ... don't always come back." 𝘂𝗟 sighed. "You could die." "Thank you for telling me," Izuku said. Mom wouldn't explain. He chewed on his lip. "I'm worried about big brother Tamura. He made it sound cool when he joined, but I don't want him to die. I'm worried about your friend, too." 𝘂𝗟 hadn't told Izuku that the young demon army got brainwashed and trained to kill. "Do you know why they took him?" "Big brother uses it as a punishment for families who have defied him. Tamura doesn't have a family. He used to be Tenko Shimura, but no one is allowed to say the name Shimura anymore. Tenko Shim." 𝘂𝗟 clamped a hand over his mouth to stop his scream. Even if big brother was temporarily gone from the palace, he shouldn't get in the habit of being so careless. His heart raced a mile a minute. A mixture of rage and grief and a little bit of hope all tangled up under his chest. Izuku tilted his head. "You know Tamura. I knew his grandmother." 𝘂𝗟 swallowed. She was a good friend of mine." His voice cracked. "She helped me stay free from my brother the first time." Nana Shimura had been a high-ranked demon lady in the Federation. The very first time 𝘂𝗟 had run away, he'd traded information about his brother for shelter, but he'd always known that Nana had helped him out of compassion. From a strictly utilitarian perspective, it would have been more profitable to take 𝘂𝗟 hostage. 𝘆𝘶 had always despised Nana, but he'd gone after her even harder because she'd stolen his precious little brother. During the same battle where he'd recaptured 𝘂𝗟, 𝘆𝘶 had killed Nana. 𝘂𝗟 had watched it happen before his eyes. He had nightmares about it. Nana had been like family to him. After Nana's death, the Shimuras had declined drastically in power. 𝘆𝘶 had lured Nana's very foolish son 𝘂𝗟 to defect and join all for one side. Then the entire Shimura family had been executed on charges of treason. This had happened shortly after 𝘂𝗟's fake death. 𝘂𝗟 had always strongly suspected that 𝘆𝘶 had faked the accusations to have an excuse to wipe out the Shimura lineage. Hisashi had been gone into an insane state after his little brother's death, determined to kill everyone with even the smallest hint of blame. Yoichi had been devastated with guilt. No matter how Kaiji and Sanzu tried to comfort him or tell him that Kotaro had made his own mistakes, Yoichi still knew that Nana's family had died because of him. Why had Tenko